good evening wherever you are, and welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today I had a chance to both keynote and be part of a couple of panels for an AI event up in New York City. So a little bit focused on financial services or things, financial services adjacent this past week. And it was a good opportunity. It was, it was probably several hundred people, but got a chance to really sit down with a couple of companies who were doing some stuff. I won't go into their names or kind of all the details of what they were doing, but it was interesting to sort of look at where they were from a maturity perspective, where the broader audience was from a maturity perspective. Obviously there's going to be, unique situations in any market, in any industry, but thought I would dive in a little bit into, maybe 7 or 8 kind of observations I made from seeing what was going on with some of these companies who, you would look at them and you would say, hey, they are, they're at the forefront of their industries. They are well-known companies, well-established operations and so forth. But looking at, how they were adopting AI, specifically generative AI, and just, holistically where they saw what they were doing, how it had evolved over the last couple of years. And we're going to dig into that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. This episode is brought to you by Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine. AI agents today operate in silos, limiting their potential. Scaling up models isn't enough. We need to scale out. Like humans did 70,000 years ago, agents must share knowledge, goals, and innovation to evolve. Outshift by Cisco is building the Internet of Cognition, transforming isolated AI systems into orchestrated superintelligence. This open infrastructure enables agents and humans to share intent, context, and reasoning. The cognition evolution for agents is here. Learn more at outshift.com. That's outshift.com. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. CoPilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I had a chance to be part of an event this past week up in New York City. Both did sort of a keynote as well as a couple of panel, kind of roundtable, fireside chat types of conversations and, some dinners and stuff. And it was a good opportunity. Again, I get a chance to talk to a lot of different companies from around the world in different industries for part of my day job, and some of those things obviously we can't talk about here on the podcast for obvious business and confidentiality reasons. But sometimes when I get a chance to do some stuff that's kind of out in the public domain, it's useful to use it both as a, way of kind of gathering inbound signals, right? What's going on in the market? What types of challenges do people have? But also as an opportunity to kind of use it as a baseline for, where are we, or at least, where is the segment of people that turned out, for this event? Where are they from a maturity standpoint? How much is the reality versus the headlines sort of, aligned or misaligned or mischaracterized and so forth. And so I thought it would be sort of interesting to dive in. I think I wrote down about 10 or so observations from the event. And this is not intended to be sort of like an event summary, but I think it was a good way of both confirming some things that we've talked about in the show, but also that we've been seeing in the marketplace, and also to get some nuance of, okay, what do those use cases, what do those case studies, what do they look like in ways that might become valuable to you as you're listening to that? So, in particular, I'm going to kind of focus on a couple of different use cases that were talked about, a couple of different implementations that were talked about. And again, these are, companies that are around the greater New York City area. So, both, from a US perspective, but also there was some international elements to what we were talking about. These are, large, well-established companies. So if you're looking at this from a small business perspective, probably not necessarily going to be relevant. And again, these are, regulated industries. So this isn't sort of, fly by the seat of your pants kind of things. These folks have to be concerned about, day-to-day operations. They have to be concerned about auditability, regulatory types of issues. And, and even as we talk about, financial services, oftentimes you think about, oh, well, they've got lots and lots of money. They're controlling the, gigantic amounts of money. Things like cost are still very much going to be part of the equation for them. So let me kind of run through these. I'm going to try and lump them together as best I can so that I can keep things coherent. But, most of these folks, that we talked about in the room were, anywhere from, so again, we always kind of go back to these turning points. We are, coming up on maybe 4 years after sort of the ChatGPT moment. So, anywhere from 3 to 4 years that the industry's been sort of looking at this stuff. These folks were, these were groups that had both spun out their AI activities out of groups that had previously done analytics and AI. So in some cases, it was, there was sort of that AI and data background coming from, who was leading these organizations, to also, folks were coming at it from an application background, right? So very few of these were sort of, at least that were being highlighted, sort of came organically out of like infrastructure teams or operations teams. They typically came out of sort of AI and analytics teams, or they came out of application teams. So this is, kind of where we saw the starting point, and saw this sort of over and over again. And the starting point for a lot of these was typically either going to be, in the case of the teams that had started, out of the analytics space, was, folks who, 5-6 years ago, you would have called them the data science team. They were building models. They were doing sort of traditional predictive analytics, or what we sort of, would call sort of non-Gen AI types of things. So people that were building their own models, they were trying to do, all sorts of things around predictive types of use cases. And have evolved over the last 3 or 4 years to be in sort of the AI space. So, these are also folks who, they'll tell you, well, we've been doing AI for a decade plus and so forth. On the application side, it did feel like a lot of the use cases were sort of spawning out of originally sort of software development centric, as we've talked about a lot, beginning to figure out how do we turn, or how do we adapt, generative AI into the software elements of people's jobs. So while not everybody is a software developer, most of the things that sort of knowledge work tends to do, has aspects in which, if you thought about it in terms of software, you are interacting with things, you are interacting with other things that probably could be an API. There are going to be workflows. There's going to be data that's involved. There's going to be scheduled types of tasks, right? All those types of things that you do in software. So there was both of those sort of got there. And in the case of those types of things, they were sort of starting from, available Gen AI tools. So in several cases, again, they started a couple of years ago, a lot of sort of, hey, we started with CoPilot, but we've now adopted a lot of things type of mindset was there. So that was sort of the first thing was, where did these teams, where did these organizations sort of start their journey? The second thing that, is very evident right now is that there is, as much as we may talk about, company X or company Y or company Z seems to have some advantage or some lead in the marketplace. Almost every single one of the companies I talked to were leveraging a whole bunch of different technologies. So there really is, while some companies might be appearing to be doing very well, whether it's an Anthropic or an OpenAI or Microsoft's lead or Google's lead or whatever it is, most of these companies that I talked to were in the stages still of, we have a little bit of everything, partially because a number of these activities started as sort of, shadow AI activities. In other cases, they were still experimenting as to whether or not, model X versus model Y versus model Z provided any difference between what was going on. So, the sort of, what did we pick? Are we all in on something is very much not the case in enterprise, no matter what you're sort of hearing from some of these vendors. Yes, there are pockets of groups that love one versus the other, but it is still a kind of a buffet of what's being used out in the marketplace. So, so there's a lot of experimenting. There's a lot of, hey, we're not exactly sure what's the right answer to this stuff. So, one of the things that I sort of said in one of the roundtables was, no matter where you might feel like you are right now, you're not as far behind as you may perceive yourself to be. The getting far behind really is the more apathetic you are towards the technology, the more kind of standoffish you are to the technology. That's probably the thing that's going to put you further behind than anything, as opposed to, oh, we chose something and we're behind because we chose X instead of Y. That is not necessarily the case. The third thing that I saw, and I sort of lump these two things together, sort of third and fourth thing that I saw was, there is distinctly an expectation, and again, it varied by company as to how they talked about it, but there is distinctly a concern about rising costs, right? I think it was sort of generally and universally discussed that whatever price you're paying for the service that you're using right now is very likely sort of a sweetheart deal, right? You're still in the stage of, whoever you are contracted to work with is giving you a price that is well below the actual cost of tokens in order to get you onboarded, in order to get you into their workflow. So there's very much a kind of, the first try is less expensive and below cost than where it's going to be. I think the general expectation is they're expecting prices to rise somewhere between 3 and 5x in terms of tokens. And there's a lot of companies who are starting to plan for that. They are trying to be flexible about what they're tied into. They're trying to build some, different types of capabilities, whether it's semantic routing of traffic to different models, maybe even some lower cost models or some small language models. There are folks who are trying to, do certain types of filtering at API gateway standpoints and so forth. So there's distinctly a concern about that. I think they're starting to get those first and second bills or renewals and, kind of realizing where the costs are going. And I bring this up just because, again, I mentioned at the beginning, banks and financial services, oftentimes you think, oh, well, they've got lots and lots of money that, cost is not typically their problem. I mean, it's distinctly a concern. Like nobody has unlimited budget for this stuff. So that was the thing that was talked about quite a bit, as well as governance, right? What it means to, where the data is going, how much trust there is as far as that, how auditable are their environments, where can they put guardrails, so, as much as people, dislike that aspect of the enterprise, right? Governance and compliance and auditing and so forth they're just part of what they do. Because again, we're talking about, things that have regulations tied to them, that have costs tied to them, that have, indemnification tied to them and so forth. And so, those things are already top of mind, even for groups that are like, hey, we're a year into a project, we're 2 years into a project. Now, the interesting sort of flip side of that is there was distinctly a language that the folks who are running these projects and we're seeing success with these projects don't want to make cost and cost cutting and cost controls the center to what they're doing, right? They are very much like, I don't want these things to be perceived as sort of cost cutting things, not in the sense of headcount, but I think they all realize, like, if you are driving a project that can somehow justify or is aligned to driving revenue, driving innovation and so forth, that is a much better place to be than a group that is sort of driving itself around cost cutting. Because what ends up happening is, and this is where it gets into some interesting language that was going on throughout the event, and you had to sort of be listening for it, you could feel a distinct sense of the folks who were presenting their stories, their case studies. They wanted to be perceived as, we are helping to drive innovation, not necessarily we are here to drive costs out of the system. And I think that's because when you're driving innovation, you are, again, you're talking sort of top line types of things. You get into what's possible. You sort of stay in experimentation mode. The scope of what you potentially are working on continues to get bigger. When you are focusing it around cost cutting, as trying to sell internal ideas, everything becomes measurable. Everything gets a distinct timeline. Everything becomes, how much faster can you do that thing? How can you show that? And again, it was very interesting, because as we talked to people who were telling their case studies and so forth, the measurement of improvements is there. Folks are actively doing it, but there wasn't necessarily a consistent language that was being used, right? In some cases, it was, our productivity. I can measure our productivity in terms of like where we were from before to where we are now, and sort of in percentage of gains. In other cases, when we were talking about workflow or process, it was measured in like hours saved on an individual basis, but maybe not necessarily rolled up on a group basis. And again, this is where, as you're thinking about this, the technology is always, it has a level of interest for various people, but at some point you're going to have to communicate that to people that aren't in the technology realm. They're not living with it every day. They're not having to, they're not as concerned about how you got something done as to, what's the output of that getting that done. And so it was interesting to watch people try and explain or not try and explain, but explain or justify or rationalize how things had evolved from before to now. And it was interesting again to watch them try and explain it to other people, and then have people sort of question like, okay, well, does that mean this? Does that, was the value in this or was the value in that? And it just reinforced the idea that, as you're working on these projects, especially if you are one of the project leaders or you're having to roll things up, you need to be prepared to explain it in, sort of non-AI terms or, in non-technical terms. And again, a lot of this goes back to, AI is not going to be all that different than a lot of things in the enterprise. It's going to be different in a lot of ways, but in the, how do you justify stuff? It's still going to get back to business, value for the business, our improvement. How do you measure improvements, and how do you show the increases of measurements of improvements and so forth in ways that other people are going to realize, right? So that was very widely spread out in terms of how well people could explain that. But it was something that, to me was sort of like, we're not really there from a maturity standpoint in terms of having best practices, in terms of having metrics that feel transferable from one group to another group, one organization to another organization, right? We're still trying to figure out the right language, because in some cases when people would talk about, okay, we implemented generative AI for this process, and it's giving those people back 2 or 3 hours a day, right? There was a set of people who would immediately take that and go, oh, okay, cool. So what you're telling me is you could eliminate this set of human elements to it. And in other cases, people were like, okay, well, what are you now doing with those extra 3 hours, right? What did that unlock for you, right? So there was distinctly, every time a measurement was highlighted, there was a set of the room who was asking questions about, what did that eliminate from a human perspective? And other sets of the room, it was like, what did that unlock from an innovation perspective? To the exact same sort of, hey, we saved 3 or 4 hours, on a per person or a per process basis, on a per daily basis or a weekly basis. So just kind of be aware that those things are kind of going on. Yeah. So the other piece that sort of came out of that conversation was as people were talking about the maturity of their projects, as they were talking about success of their projects or metrics of their projects, the next logical question that kept coming up over and over again was, do you trust the results, right? And I think trust becomes sort of that next thing, whether it's, so cost becomes a thing, governance becomes a thing, and then trust becomes a thing. And trust is a very difficult thing for really anybody to measure, right? It was a lot of, do you trust the results? How do you communicate in a way that others are going to trust what you're delivering? And again, in these regulated industries, without getting into all the details, there's, decades and decades and decades of very predictive types of tools that have been able to go and look at spreadsheets and go and look at market data and go and look at results and know mathematically those answers are correct. And so there was a lot of, you're now introducing some technology that is not necessarily deterministic. It's, it's predictive. How can you trust that? And so there really was an interesting level of conversation around, how do you explain trust? How well do you trust it? How do you measure trust? What are you doing to try and control the outputs of the system so that they have less drift, less hallucination, less things that are untrustworthy? And so, again, this is going to sound like, oh, wait a second, are you talking about AI? Are you just talking about, every technology in enterprise for the last 25 years? The answer to both those questions is yes, right? And so I think is it terribly cool and new and innovative? No, not necessarily. But, you're also talking about, your banking system and knowing like what, money tends to be something people would like to know exact answers, not sort of rounding errors and so forth. So that was interesting. I mean, it was to listen to the conversation, to listen to the language, about how people were explaining trust, or they were conveying the idea of trust, or how well do you trust the system, or how well should we trust the system, and what can you do around that, whether it's putting in guardrails or red teaming or so on and so forth. Just the amount of work that has to go into working with these tools that are by nature not deterministic, but try and sort of bend them and force them to create outputs, to be involved with things where people want the output to be deterministic and predictable and kind of finite. And those are probably even the wrong words, but like they want the answer to be correct, if you will. So the next thing that was really interesting to watch is, and this is where sort of maturity curves came in. I sat at one table and there was folks who had been doing this for a couple of years. They felt relatively good about what they were doing outside of, concerns about cost and governance and so forth, who were starting to lay out sort of, here's our roadmap for the next 2 or 3 or 4, use cases and so forth. And there were other people at the table who literally were like, I don't see a use case for this still. I don't know exactly how I would use this. I would love to sort of gather some stuff. So there's still very much a fragmentation of use cases. I think the folks who were sort of laying out roadmaps had very much taken the mindset of, we are going to find ways to either introduce AI into what we do or become AI first in these things. And it, again, it echoes what we've talked about in some of these things. I know Brandon and I have talked about it. You sort of have to just sort of jump in with 2 feet with it. Whereas others were, I think, looking at it more, what's the right word? They were looking at it sort of from the outside, trying to predict what the outcome would look like before they had sort of started to engage the technology in meaningful ways. And so I think, you're probably going to see this within your organization is, the spread, the spectrum of people that I don't want to say get it versus don't get it, because that's not the right way of looking at it. But I think AI, what we're seeing is it is a technology that you just sort of have to, be in the arena and start utilizing it, start applying it, start figuring out how it can be part of what you do versus trying to do it from the sidelines. And so, like I said, there's use case fragmentation. I think the use cases are still very not centralized. They're still very domain specific, group specific, idea specific, use case specific, as opposed to being sort of an umbrella for covering a whole lot of different things, right? And I think the other thing that we heard quite a bit, I mean, this again was from folks who have been doing it for multiple years, what they had seen and what they were experiencing and what they were going through was sort of things began as decentralized, so sort of shadow AI. It had evolved into some leadership within the organization saying, we need to kind of get a handle on this. We need to be able to, whether it is controlling cost and governance and so forth, or whether it is just centralizing some people that have more advanced learning curves in this thing. So we sort of went from decentralized sort of shadow AI. These organizations were talking about sort of having these more centralized groups who, again, probably, still their first couple of use cases, their first couple of implementations are going to be in what's going to feel like a fragmented, sort of decentralized organization or sort of use cases. And then what they were saying is that was starting to mature, and they were showing some results in ways that they figured out how to communicate within the organization. Then they were kind of seeing this decentralization, but in a semi-controlled manner, right? So maybe decentralization using common tools, using common platforms, using common process and so forth. So I think the thing that we often see within enterprises, which is centralization, then decentralization because you can't keep up, and then centralization because costs get a little outside of where they want it to be, or they've had some issues. I think we're going to expect to see that pretty regularly, sort of centralized, decentralized for those reasons. And so, I don't know that there is necessarily a best practice that's evolved yet. I think it's going to be on a company by company basis. It's going to be on a, how's your organization organized, right? Like, do you get a lot of benefit in the organization from having centralized shared functions? Do you get a lot of benefit from decentralized group innovation flexibility that's out there? But, from the companies that we had talked to who, again, you would say, well, they probably have some mix of shared centralized services and the individual lines of business or the individual groups have a certain amount of autonomy. They were already beginning to see that decentralized, centralized, decentralized wave pattern happening. And again, really what they ultimately said where they were looking for, ways in which they could get the benefit of these learning curves in ways that they could accelerate things. And then as they began to kind of get a grasp of stuff, again, it went back to sort of a decentralized, okay, go run with this new sort of best practice, this new framework of doing it, and then see where you can go. And then if we have to centralize that back and figure out how to refine it, they would do that. And then again, the idea was we would then propagate that out to the next group or the next group. So I think we're going to see this quite a bit. And again, we've talked about this. AI is such a technology these days that is so tangible to so many people. Things probably aren't going to stay centralized for very, very long before groups start doing it on their own. I think the question just becomes like, as they are decentralized, how distinct, diverse, unique do they get to where for those things that have to have a certain amount of sort of centralization to them, again, cost and governance and auditability and, some sort of best practice, how much work is that group that's in that middle constantly having to do because they're getting things back that are like 50 different variants versus like 4 or 5 different variants. So that was a conversation that went on quite a bit. And then the last thing I'll mention here is, we talked a little bit about, some of the new sort of AI, cyber concerns that are out there in terms of things like Mythos and GPT 5.5 cyber and some of the, the new AI tools that are both, there to help software teams and security teams in terms of finding bugs and identifying vulnerabilities and so forth, but also the fact that these tools are getting into the hands of hackers and black hats and so forth. And it was very obvious that even within a room of, folks within the financial services community and some adjacent groups and so forth, that those tools aren't necessarily available to everybody. And by no means is the understanding of what those tools do, generally known at this point. So there is going to be a steep learning curve and a steep, distribution of that knowledge. So the ones who I did talk to who had seen it, kind of had a sense of, some of the, the fears and the concerns are very real. The folks who had not seen it really just, it's kind of, you don't know what you don't know type of thing. So, So anyways, gone for a while. I think those are my big takeaways from this. The enterprise things haven't changed a whole lot with AI, right? I mean, it's still going to be, challenging to get it distributed widely across a lot of groups in a consistent way. There is still going to be a certain amount of bottom-up innovation that's going to happen. There's going to be a certain amount of top-down control that has to happen, and visibility that has to happen, accountability. But, I think the other thing is there's still a huge sort of gap in the maturity curve across companies, in the adoption curve across companies, in the learning curve within groups and so forth. So it is, to sort of go back to an old phrase and sort of joke that we talk about. I mean, we are in really, really early innings. Now, the innings are moving a little faster than maybe we saw in previous generations, but we are in very, very early innings and very asymmetric innings at this point. The amount of information that's being, made available is getting consumed, but not in any sort of consistent way. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Hopefully that's somewhat useful. I know I'd had to sort of anonymize certain things and I didn't get into all the details, but, would be curious, within your industry, again, this was sort of somewhat financial service and financial service adjacent. Within your industries, within your verticals, are you seeing similar types of things? Are you seeing very, very different things? Would love to hear about it. Show at the Enterprise AI Show. Hit us up. Let us know what you think. And with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things Enterprise AI.